All right. Let's talk about the three branches of government. This is the stuff that's outlined really in the Constitution. This is going to be an overview of some of those things in terms of what you need to know about the three branches of government. Really what you got to think about are some of the jobs and things that they have that make each branch unique, why we have three branches and things like that. And we'll talk about some of those here in just a moment. All right, so the first branch, we're going to call it the legislative branch, okay? Really, this is outlined by the job of the Congress, the people that you vote to represent an area where you live, a certain geographic region. So let's talk about some of the jobs of the legislative branch. Probably the most important one that they have is that they create and pass laws, okay? So these are the guys that are coming up with laws, taxes, and things like that. Who's going to be affected by these laws, and that's the kind of stuff that they juggle with. Second job they have is they give money for laws and programs. Okay, so they allocate the funding. Tax dollars come in, they use that money for new roads, education, the military, all kinds of things like that. The third thing they do is approve treaties and presidential appointments. Okay, now this doesn't mean like a doctor's appointment. When you appoint somebody to a job, ultimately you're giving them a job. Okay, you're saying, here, you have this job, I want you to have this job. They're not elected or anything like that. So what we have here is they approve treaties. So that means that if we're at war and we need to end the war peacefully or whatever the case might be, it has to be approved by Congress. And then it says, and presidential appointments. Okay, so what that means is the president can appoint, say, a judge to the Supreme Court. He said, we don't elect the judge, the president appoints that judge, and that judge then has to be approved by Congress. Okay, and then the last one says establish federal courts. So that simply means that they put, again, people like judges and stuff like that that work in courthouses and throughout the country, ultimately at the federal level, and we'll talk about that later. Second thing I want to talk about is the way that the legislative branch is made up. The first part, okay, of the legislative branch is the Senate. Okay, we have what's called a bicameral Congress, which means that there's two houses, and that just simply means that there's two groups of people that represent the people living in the United States of America. Okay, the Senate is one of two houses, like I said. Each state has two senators. Okay, so that means that all the states have an equal amount of senators representing each state. So California, one of the largest states, only has two senators. Rhode Island, being one of the smallest states, also has two senators. So they're on equal footing when you think about it in those terms. The last one is they serve for 6-year terms. And that just simply means that when they're elected, they have the job for 6 years, pretty close to no matter what. Okay? So those are some things that you need to know about the Senate. The second house of Congress is called the House of Representatives. Okay? Now, this group of people is a little bit larger than the Senate. Now, let me tell you why. Okay? Now, a representative is just somebody that ultimately speaks and makes decisions on the behalf of a larger group of people. In this case, it would be a part of a state. Okay? So say West Michigan, we're talking about a couple of people that represent that area in the state of Michigan. Okay? Now, let me talk about how many representatives each state has. Okay? The number of each state's representatives is based on population. So states that have more people living in them will have more representatives. States that have less people living in them will have less representatives. Okay? So the least populated state in the country is Wyoming. Okay? The most densely populated state in the United States is California. So California is going to have a lot more representatives than is Wyoming. Okay? Now, one of the things about the House of Representatives is that there's more turnover. They only serve for 2-year terms. Okay? And that's what makes them, they're more representative of the people because they're in there for a shorter amount of time and there's more of them. Okay? It's more localized. And we'll get into some of those details here a little bit later. All right, second branch is what's known as the executive branch. Okay, now if you don't know about the executive branch, basically this is the president. This is the job of the president. Okay, when we refer to the executive branch, we're referring to the president of the United States and the people that work for him ultimately. Okay, so let's take a look. Some of the jobs of the president. His job is to carry out laws passed by Congress. So that means he's the guy that ultimately signs a bill into a law. So the Congress, they're like, this is what the law is going to look like, and the president has to carry that out, which means he has to sign it so it actually can be enforced. Okay. The second thing that he does, probably one of the more important jobs, is the commander-in-chief of the military. So he's kind of like the head guy in the military. All the generals in the Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army, all of those guys have to answer to the president. He ultimately makes the decisions. Not to say that other people don't advise him on his decisions, but he is the one that will ultimately decide how we use our military. Okay, the president is the guy that negotiates treaties. So he's the guy at the table. If we're at war with another country, he'll sit down at the table and try to come up with an agreement to end the war and those types of things. Okay, and one of the other jobs that he has is that he appoints federal judges, which means he gets to pick who's in the Supreme Court if there's an empty seat. So if somebody retires or dies, the president's job is to pick somebody to replace that person. So there you have the jobs of the president. Here we have electing the president, and this is where things can get a little confusing. So we'll talk about some of these more in depth throughout this chapter. Electing the president. So the people don't just simply vote for the president and he becomes president. There's a little different process. It's called the Electoral College, and this group of people ultimately choose the president. Okay, we vote on how we think the Electoral College, or on who the Electoral College should choose. And then this process takes place where they vote, and ultimately these are the people electing the president. And we'll get into some of the specifics with that a little bit later on. The president is elected to a 4-year term. Again, he can serve for 2 terms, so a total of 8 years. But nonetheless, we vote for presidents every 4 years in the United States. And of course, you must be 35 years old in order to run and be elected president. Okay, so there's some of the process of electing the president, some of the criteria. Removal of the president. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you can remove the president. It's called impeachment. The Congress has to accuse the president of high crimes, things like bribery, some pretty underhanded stuff, and ultimately they can vote to impeach the president. It's not an easy thing to do, but nonetheless, it is a possibility of things they have. And sometimes you hear about it because politicians are upset or whatever the case might be about something the president did, but usually it doesn't. They don't have a big enough reason to impeach the president, but it has happened. So that's how you would ultimately remove the president from his job. And then, of course, we see the White House. This is where the president lives, works, that kind of thing. Pretty famous building there in Washington, D.C. Third branch is what we know as the judicial branch. Let's talk about the jobs of the judicial branch. The judicial branch, you want to remember, is these are the judges. Okay, particularly in the Supreme Court, but there's different layers of courts, the highest being the Supreme Court, and we'll focus on that. Their job is to interpret the law. Did this person actually break one of the laws that Congress and President passed? And their job is ultimately to interpret that. They review lower court decisions, so if you appeal something, it's the judicial branch's job is to say, let's take a look at this and see if it's correct. Ultimately, we have they judge whether laws and executive actions are constitutional. So they're always looking at the Constitution to make sure that the laws abide by what it says in the Constitution. Okay, and then, of course, if there's a dispute between states, these federal judges will decide because they really don't have a stake in it. You know what I mean? So if Michigan wanted to sue Ohio, the Supreme Court would take a look at it and look at the reasons why, because they don't live in Michigan or Ohio. Okay, so they rule on cases between states. Usually it has to do with commerce and buying and selling things between states. Judicial hierarchy. Okay, this is just talking about who's on top. Okay, where's the top court in the land versus some of the other ones. We've got things like district courts, appellate courts, and then you've got the Supreme Court. So if you appeal through these processes, you go through these steps ultimately to get to the Supreme Court where the decisions are final. These guys are like, yep, we've seen your court, we know you've appealed it, this, that. Whatever decision they make on a court case ultimately is final. So the judicial hierarchy, remember there's like layers to courts. Okay, you got local courts all the way up then to the Supreme Court. So that gives you kind of an idea of how that works. Some of the weird things about, or what I would call oddities of the judicial branch, these guys, once they're appointed, they have the job for the rest of their life or until they decide they want to quit. Okay, so that's one of the things that you see. You see a lot of older judges that are Supreme Court justices for their entire life, ultimately since they were appointed. The second thing is judicial review. This is what they do. They look at the laws and they say, okay, does this law abide by the Constitution? And we talked a little bit about that earlier, but we call this process judicial review. So they look at it, it's all been laid out, and they say, okay, I've got a problem with this, and then they start talking about it. Does it go with the Constitution, yes or no? So those are some of the oddities that abide with the judicial branch in particular. So there you have the three branches of government. Just an overview. It gives you some of the important stuff that you need to know. Take a look at this, rewind it, get to know some of the jobs and the specifics of each of these branches of government. And then we'll talk about, well, why do we have three branches? Okay, and yeah, we should be good to go with that. So there you have the three branches of